Hi, I'm Robert Levine. I'm here with Andreas Delfs, who, among other things, is the music director of the Milwaukee Symphony and consequently my boss. Most people never get to ask their boss on camera all the things that they wanted to, and I won't be the first. But I will ask him some questions that I've always wanted to ask, not only him, but conductors in general, as well as his thoughts on the industry and the function of music director and related topics. But what I'd like to start with is some biographical information. You were actually born in Flensburg, which, after having done some research last night, I discovered is the second most northern city in Germany, after a town in Sylt.
Oh, that is true. Geographically
Right.
it is, but Sylt is an island,
Sylt
so we
is an
don't
island,
count that.
right.
No, we're always very proud that Flensburg is the most
Right.
northern town in
Right.
Germany.
And it was actually part of Denmark for most of its history, on and off.
It changed on and off. Yeah.
Right.
My grandmother, for example, grew up with 3 different nationalities. She changed 3 times during her lifetime.
It was also, its renown as the home of Elvira Madigan, and it apparently got its start as the center of the European kipper industry in the Middle Ages.
That's true.
I think it's okay. What impact on a musician would be growing up in that part of Germany as opposed to, say, Bavaria, Munich?
Well, what's very particular about the north of Germany is that it's firmly Lutheran. It's a very Lutheran territory. So throughout the history of my hometown, the music that was performed in the 2 main churches was important. Flensburg has about 20 churches, but there were 2 main churches that had both fully state-paid music directors. Kirchenmusikdirektor, same job basically that Bach had. And they did pretty fabulous stuff. First of all, they were all incredible organists. So I had wonderful piano and organ teachers. Both churches had wonderful choirs. So from my very early memories on, I can remember performances of the big Bach Passions oratories and the Christmas oratory and cantatas and Messiah and all of the great oratory literature in very, very professional and very good renditions. First listening, then later singing in the children's choir, and then later, after my voice broke, becoming a tenor in that same choir. So that, I would say, is the most important and really significant influence, because the level of those performances were on the same level that you would hear in Hamburg, Munich, Frankfurt, Berlin, because the choirs were very good and the orchestras were hired from the big cities. The other thing is that Flensburg, being a town of about 100,000, has, like any decent German town, a Stadttheater, a city theater that has a little orchestra, a resident company of singers, a resident ballet company, a small chorus, and an acting troupe. So I grew up with a decent theater where I could see all the magic flutes and all the Hänsel and Gretels and Rigolettos and even Rosenkavalier in decent performances, small scale because the house and the orchestra were small, but very, very well done. So I got to know a lot of operatic repertory, plus great ballets and great plays from a very early age on. And since my mother was and is an actress, I've been a lifelong fan of drama theater and got to know that very early on too.
I wanted to mention that your mother actually has a long list of credits on the Internet Movie Database.
Yeah.
She was very prominent in German television.
She still is.
Still is, okay. Did that have an impact on your thinking about what you wanted to do? I mean, was it...
Not so much. My mother's television career started relatively late in her life. She was on stage all through my youth, and about when I graduated from high school, she was discovered and became a very popular staple of the German soap opera industry. And other than meeting a lot of interesting people that in some way or other influenced my work, I mean, I met some people from the show business industry that some of them were very good musicians and very interesting musicians, and I've always had no problem in straddling the lines between serious music and not so serious music, because I learned early on there's really just good and bad. There is not, a good performance of My Fair Lady is wonderful. A bad performance of the Bruckner Symphony is terrible. It's really just the quality that makes the difference.
Not only terrible, but longer.
Yeah, that's true.
You went to college in Hamburg and then did a master's at Juilliard
Mhm.
and studied with at Juilliard.
George Mester,
Okay.
Sixten Ehrling, who passed away this past January. The great thing at Juilliard was people came through a lot. So I had master classes with Scholti, with Bernstein quite a lot, because in those years that I was a student at Juilliard, he didn't work so much and he lived around the corner. Karajan came by. It was wonderful because when a great conductor was in town, we were allowed to go to Carnegie Hall or Avery Fisher or wherever, watch the rehearsals. And then that conductor would either come to Juilliard, give a master class with the orchestra, or at the very least sit with us and talk. So that was a great time.
Would it actually be helpful,
Yeah.
what they said?
Many, many times it was. I remember the most intense was Bernstein, because he would never teach half-heartedly. He was such a preacher and such a rabbi that he really... it started normally with an orchestral master class, and then we talked and talked and talked. Then we moved over to his apartment and kept talking till 4 o'clock in the morning. And then the next day we met again to maybe see a performance at Lincoln Center that we then had to talk about again. He was such a cross-connected mind. Everything, whether it was the museum or the stage or music or good food or people, that all connected in his mind to make music. And that was very interesting and very helpful. Others, Karajan, for example, was very helpful with technical details.
Yeah.
Was really saying, when you do the recitativo in Beethoven 9, the cello and bass recitativo, watch out for this, watch out for that. Here you have to be sure they always be early. Every orchestra in the world is always early here. And when I come to these spots with you guys or guest conducting, always remember, yes, he's right. Everybody does come in early here.
We have orchestra musicians have their own little pet peeves that it doesn't matter who's conducting or what orchestra.
They always screw up.
Never
that.
works. Well, not the conductors, but this passage always doesn't work in a certain way.
Yeah. And for a young conductor, it's not bad to know these things early on, because it helps you planning your rehearsal a little bit, and it helps you to, especially when you're very young, and so you're very nervous when you conduct an orchestra for the first time. And you freeze and your ears block up a little bit. Yeah. If you already know 2 or 3 things to say because you have been forewarned, it breaks the ice. It makes you relax, and it makes you say something. And the musicians, as you just said, know these spots, but at least they will know that the conductor does too.
And if you know what's going to go wrong, it's a little easier to hear that it went wrong, and then you can start thinking about that.
Absolutely.
That's interesting. So from Juilliard, you went pretty much straight to Pittsburgh.
I went to 3 places at the same time from Juilliard. One of the great things about Juilliard is the network of connections, and that they really help you to find your place in the real world. And George Mester was a good friend of Dennis Russell Davis,
who I worked for in St. Paul.
In St. Paul with the chamber orchestra, who hired me right out of school for his present job, which was the Stuttgart State Opera in Stuttgart, Germany. At the same time, I got a job. Andre Previn was leaving Pittsburgh, and if you remember, in a rush. So he called Juilliard and said, who do you have? We need quickly a under-assistant conductor. This was called the Steinberg Fellow, and it got me into Pittsburgh 4 or 5 times a year for a week to do children's concerts and educational stuff and covering weeks and so forth. So those 2 jobs plus the Swiss National Youth Orchestra, which I had auditioned for.
And that was where?
In Zurich.
Okay.
So I took the train Stuttgart-Zurich quite a bit.
Okay.
It was easy. Right. It was a wonderful combination of things, because it was theater, it was a fabulous professional American orchestra, and it was working with young people. And these 3 things are still the staple of my work. So it was a great beginning.
Did you have a lot of exposure to Mazzella when you were in Pittsburgh then, or?
No, because
did he become a primary influence for you, or?
Later.
Okay.
He did. Laurent Mazel, I met for the first time when he was just doing a guest concert in Pittsburgh, which was back then very sensational because he was this world famous maestro, and he hadn't conducted in Pittsburgh.
And he was
before.
from there too, actually.
That is why he came, because his dad and mom lived in Pittsburgh, and he promised them that he would come. His
mother, I think he conducted that orchestra when he was 12 or something.
Yeah, and he was a violinist in that orchestra for a number of years. Right. So, Lauren is an accomplished violinist, and he played in the first violin section for a number of years. And that's how I met him, and then the orchestra fell in love with him, and he conducted more and more, eventually became their music advisor because Previn really had left a void by the abruptness of his leaving. And when he, because Previn really had left a void by the abruptness of his leaving, and when he was hired, and when he accepted the job as full-time music director, he had seen me work a couple of times and met me and wanted me then as full-time assistant conductor. But that was a couple of years later.
So what did you take away from him?
I think Lorin Maazel is the most professional Kapellmeister. That means the conductor that knows the craft and the art of conducting there is in the world. His rehearsal planning, his stick technique, his ear, his never wasting a minute of a musician's time, his enthusiasm and dynamic on the podium, which is often, not anymore, but back then was often misinterpreted as vanity and posing. It's not. He's just a very elegant conductor, that's all. His being a music director, which is a completely different kettle of fish than being a conductor. The skills that you need to have to be a music director, Lorin is a virtuoso in that too. Dealing with boards, going out, giving interviews, being a figurehead for the orchestra. His work in the recording studio, which is brilliant. He's a recording artist, and I mean the way he spans and spreads out a recording session is just perfect. And I've just seen him in New York and talked to a couple of members of the orchestra, some of them being ex-members of the Milwaukee Symphony. Right. And it was those things that I just mentioned that they adore about him too, and that I know the Pittsburgh Symphony adored throughout his whole tenure there.
Musically, was he an influence?
Less so.
Yeah.
Because his great specialities, I would say, back then, they've changed a little bit. Conductors change through their life, which is a fact that orchestra players not often recognize. But musicians, conductors are different in every decade of their life. When I met him and worked with him, I think what he did incredible was French repertory, Stravinsky, Prokofiev. Not so much, I mean, he did very good Beethoven and Brahms, but not as good as it does it now, I think. And that, back then and now, is what I love the best. So I always enjoyed watching him doing these things, but musically he was not such a big influence. Richard Strauss, for example, he was a good influence. And later, when he went to Munich, funny enough, one of my favorite composers, Bruckner, became something that he did really well, and I think right now he's one of the finest Bruckner conductors around. Yes.
Interesting. So that's not something one would have predicted 20, 30 years ago.
This is why I say, one has to be always prepared for the fact that a conductor changes even in his 7th and 8th decade of life, and something that I didn't expect from Lorin, and certainly didn't see him doing so much in in Pittsburgh, is something that he does a lot now and does extremely well, and that's Bruckner.
Is there a conductor that you think of as a model, or there are thought of as being schools? There's kind of a Koussevitzky school. There's a very famous diagram that's actually in our library of Koussevitzky and all the conductors that studied with him or studied with people that studied with him. It's really too big to say that it's a Koussevitzky school, but there was a Monteux whole tradition of people. Is there anything that you relate to in that way?
There's a couple of conductors that through their recordings and what I've seen on video impressed me very much and influenced me a little bit in my thinking. One is Otto Klemperer, who I think in the Germanic repertory that has always been the center of what I do, is incredible. Because the mix of being authentic and clear and not doing strange, weird things, but on the other hand being so free and so improvisatory with it. It always sounds so rhapsodic when he does Beethoven, like inventing it on the spur of the moment, and Brahms too. Yet if you look at it with the score, he doesn't do anything that's not there. He doesn't add any weird things. And towards the end of his life, after he had several strokes, it was a little bit more difficult. But when he was in his prime, when he was 40 and 50, during the years that he ran the Kroll Opera in Berlin, and those recordings and early videos I find quite incredible, and I've known them a long time and always come back as saying this is somebody that I'd love to have met. Unfortunately, I didn't. And somebody that I got to see later in my life, again only through videos, is Georges Sell, who I know was not very popular with musicians, or I've heard that.
Well, he was not. He was a difficult boss, although it was a different time, obviously.
But I think his conducting is unbelievably clear. His rehearsals that I've seen a couple on video are very inspiring and very clear. He knows so much what he wants, and he gets it so well. And I don't like to watch him so much because he looks a little, I don't know, body language I find a little edgy. But the eyes, people always say Fritz Reiner controlled the orchestra with his eyes, and I agree that, but it scares me. I could not play a note under Fritz Reiner.
There's a wonderful, have you seen that, the Great Conductors video, I think, and there's a shot of, from the bass section, of Reiner conducting Chicago, and at one point he turns and stares at the basses, and it's exactly like something out of Jurassic Park, where the Velociraptor is focused in on his prey, and he almost doesn't look human.
No, he glares. He really glares, and I don't know, I couldn't play with that. But Sell, I thought, looks firm and strict, but also inspiring at the same time. He has these, I think they were blue, I cannot see in the old black and white videos, but very bright eyes, and I feel, if I imagine I would be a musician under Sell, I feel guided yet inspired at the same time. Of the living conductors, much harder. When he was alive, he was dead, but only recently, Carlos Kleiber was just an incredible conductor and such an inspiring rehearsal.
Von Karajan, not so much?
Von Karajan, yes. But I saw him mostly when he was older, and when the relationship between him and the Berlin Philharmonic had started to get a little iffy. Right. What I remember from Karajan was when I saw him rehearsing on tour, amazed me a lot. I saw him a couple of times in New York, preparing the orchestra for the evening performance of a Brahms symphony, which he and the orchestra have done hundreds of times. Yet, he would spend an hour on one little detail, which I thought was amazing. I remember him doing the beginning of Brahms 4. For the whole first half of the rehearsal, 1 hour, 15 minutes, the first 8 bars.
Do you think that was a technique to get the orchestra's attention, in a sense?
Yes,
or
definitely.
It was not just so much about those bars, it was just about raising the standard.
Attention, to keep it fresh. He rethought it. I think I've seen conduct Karajan Brahms Symphony with Berlin Philharmonic many times. It was always a little different. He rethought it constantly. The changes were subtle, just for us people to hear, not really for the audience. Right. But they were there, and it kept it fresh and it kept it inspiring. I also remember from Karajan that although he was a real maestro, in how he posed and how he conducted himself, he really let the orchestra play much more than people gave him credit for. I remember the end of Brahms 1. He launched it in so it wouldn't fall apart, and then he leaned back and let the orchestra play and enjoy it by themselves. That was something that people didn't realize about him, but I think the players, after he was gone, realized what a wonderful gift that was, that he guided them through the difficult passages where they needed to be shown and where they needed clarity. But then when it came to the climax and to just let it go, he basically stayed out of the way.
I have a friend who studied with Monteux and quoted Monteux saying that conducting is sometimes like riding a horse, whereas the horse sometimes needs you, a lot of the time doesn't, and part of conducting is figuring out which is which.
Yeah,
and
exactly.
Knowing, behaving appropriately.
Yeah. One conductor who's very good, and I should mention, because I haven't mentioned a single living conductor, Dohnányi is very good at that. I was Dohnányi's student at the Hamburg Conservatory, and we stayed in touch over the years. So I saw him a couple of times with Cleveland, and I just saw him last week with his new orchestra, the Hamburg Radio Orchestra. And he has a wonderful way of being very, very specific and very helpful in rehearsal, and really, he worked on intonation for an hour. But that's what they needed at that rehearsal. It was Bartók and Mozart. And then the concert was so free and so inspiring because they felt they had raised a level in rehearsal and enjoyed that feeling in the concert.
Right. I'm pretty normal in being fascinated by conducting. not really wanting to do it, but not really feeling like I understand what it's like, even though I've been and conducted orchestras and have talked to a lot of conductors. Sometimes I think it would help musicians if they had half an hour in front of their orchestra just to understand that it's not as easy as what it seems like when you're conducting Beethoven at home with the record.
Or the music director half an hour in the back of the viola section.
That, you know,
would help too.
and actually I think it has been helpful to some conductors. And, you know, you mentioned Mazel, but Detroit, for example, spent years in the back of the Suisse Romand viola section. Monsieur was a violist. And I still don't really know what. I'm not even convinced that most conductors really understand what they're doing. Which is not to say they're not doing it well, but there's an element of which is really beyond technique. I mean, it's, if anything would convince me that there was such a thing as telepathy, it would be conducting.
Yeah, it's very hard to analyze what's going on. And we talked just a minute ago about who I like as a conductor, and what always strikes me is that there is such a difference in opinion sometimes on the quality of a conductor between a conductor and an orchestra player. I sometimes talk to musicians who rave about a conductor, and I say, I don't know what you saw in him. I thought it was a boring performance, and honestly, you guys didn't sound that great. But, you know, the orchestra says, oh, this is the greatest we ever had. And vice versa. I sometimes am incredibly moved by a performance and in tears, and then I talk to some friends in the orchestra, and they say, oh, I didn't like it, it was not clear. You know? It's very hard to say, and I think the effect that a particular conductor, or I probably should say the collaboration between a conductor and an orchestra, has on an audience also differs quite. It's hard to analyze, and your thing with telepathy is not so wrong. The word conductor actually means to transport something. So I think a good conductor transports his vision of a score, which hopefully is exciting, by means of gestures and words in rehearsal, into or through a body of about 100 musicians that all have different ideas about that particular score, but that the result that comes out is something that sounds so convincing and so coherent that it connects with the audience and everybody involved. And how that is done, a mixture of things you do and say in rehearsal, I'm often amazed when we play a piece for the first time in rehearsal, how much is already communicated just by, you know, the choice of tempo, the gestures, the choice when I want to show you something or when I would just lean back and let you do it by yourself. And then in concert it can be completely different again, because we had a pianist here a couple of weeks ago, Arnaldo Cohen.
Yeah, right.
And he said something very sweet. I thought, he said, you know, a concert is nothing but an invitation, an appointment with inspiration. It's an appointment with inspiration. And sometimes inspiration is a little late, and sometimes inspiration is on time, and sometimes inspiration doesn't show up. And that's very wise, because that it is. And so the different factors that lead to a concert, and also to a relationship between an orchestra and a conductor, whether it's a one-time guest shot or a frequent guest appearance or a music directorship, is a combination out of these things. And the process of the first meeting, the first rehearsal, the second rehearsal, often harder than the first rehearsal, the concert, and the second concert, which is often much harder than the first, and the second visit, as you know.
Right.
Often we have guest conductors here who you guys think is the greatest thing since sliced bread for the first time, and he comes for the second time and is, nah.
Yep.
Why?
Yep.
You explain me. I can't explain it as badly as you can.
Yeah. When things are going well, I mean, I was thinking last night, Tchaikovsky 5, at its best, it begins to feel like chamber music. Although, obviously, the conductor isn't playing anything, but there is a sense the conductor is responding as much to what's happening as we are to the conductor.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and that's what's so hard about the relationship, because in one sense, the conductor is very much, I mean, it's very almost kind of plantation-like mentality. The conductor says, do this, and we do it. And yet, when it's working well, it's so much more collaborative than that. And yet it happens, you know, it can be both on different levels.
Yeah. It's such a combination of things, and if you add to the equation the music director bit of it, a good music director is a combination out of many, many qualities. the best have them all 100%. But most often you will find that a music director is a little bit better in this department, a little less here, and you might desire a little bit more here, but he's very good here. So what conductor and what music director is right and good for any given orchestra at that given time of that orchestra's history, there's a great bandwidth of variation in there. And you mentioned yesterday evening, it was a typical example. We have worked together for 10 years now. So lots of things that we want from each other go without words. It was
and
a piece...
And we've done a fair amount of Tchaikovsky Romantic too.
And we have done Tchaikovsky 5 a number of times. So we know, you know what I expect from you, and I know exactly what you give me, and many times it's just saying, this is great, just a little more, you know. And we've enjoyed this piece before, so we already go in there with saying, oh, this is going to be fun tonight, let's give it our best shot. Plus yesterday evening was special because we had a couple of new musicians in the orchestra, which also is a certain, adds a little bit to the electricity to it. So those are the moments that our job is fun.
Yeah. I wanted to talk, and actually it's a good segue into the music director aspect of the business. First of all, it's a commonly held conception, I expect correct, that it's a very different job in Europe than it is in this country. And you've done more of it actually here than you have in Europe, but you've done both. So is that actually true? Is that general statement true, or is it more subtle than that?
There's a whole chapter of being a music director in America that doesn't exist in Europe. Because most European orchestras are state subsidized, so the taxpayer pays for them. There is really no need for fundraising, development. Yes, there is a board of directors, but it is a very different board of directors. Basically, the intendant, which is the executive director, and the Minister of Art and Culture of the city or the state run the show financially. And normally there's not big problems. I mean, I remember when I was music director of Hanover, which was orchestra and opera. Yes, once a year I had lunch with the minister and the intendant, and they said, well, you know, we had statewide cuts, so it's going to be a little less next year. But those variations in funding were not dramatic. They were never on a scale that we had to worry about our existence. And the part that in America the music director has to be involved is like, you know, having a relationship with the board, going out with the CEO to talk to some corporate sponsors and some individuals, is quite time consuming. It requires skills that are other than conducting, and I quite enjoy them, because the difference on the positive side is that I'm much closer to the audience in America, because I know the people personally who care enough about the orchestra that they give either a tremendous amount of their time and energy as volunteers or board members, or a large amount of their private money to make it work. In Germany or in Europe, the audience was much more an indefinite group for me. I mean, I knew some people because they came up and introduced and we became friendly, but I don't know them because they are physically, mentally, emotionally, financially involved in
They're
the
not
orchestra.
individuals to you in the same way.
Exactly.
What impact does that have on programming decisions? I would think intuitively that it would have a fair amount, that there's much less pressure to program pieces that you know people will want to come to hear. And yet, you know, if you look at the European orchestras I've seen, the programming does not look, for the most part, terribly adventuresome.
It depends very much where you are. If you are involved with one of the great radio orchestras, it's more adventuresome. If you're in one of the big cities, it can and needs to be more adventuresome, especially if you're in a city that has several orchestras like Berlin or Munich or Hamburg. I tell you what's the important factor. If you cannot be flexible on your programming ideals as a music director, in America you eventually will get into trouble, I think. Because the thing that we talked about earlier, that the finances of an orchestra in America is so much more dependent on individuals, that means that the economic fate of an orchestra fluctuates much more in America. And you have to be able to respond to that. If you're chairman of the board and the CEO come to you and say, you know, your predecessor through a number of years has really lost the audience, was too esoteric or too modern or whatever it is.
Too much Dvorak, for example.
Or Bruckner.
Right.
That can happen.
Yeah.
If you don't hit the nerve of your audience, you can lose audience with programming. I don't want to call it bad programming, because in a different city it might be wonderful programming. It just has to fit the need of your audience and the temperature of the community at the time.
Do you have a philosophy about programming that's independent of that?
I have my preferences.
Okay.
I have what I like. And certainly,
but it's not just a question of repertoire, it's how you put the programs together too. I mean, do you...
Yeah, my philosophy is this, and that's the same in America and in Europe. First and foremost, I mean, of course we're talking about now programming through several seasons, not only like a guest concert,
right.
but when you're music director. First, build trust. Build trust with your audience by making sure that what you do in your first couple of years is really good. That everything the audience hears in the first season or first 2 or 3 seasons of a new music director is so first rate that they come to believe every time so-and-so's on the podium, its quality is impeccable. Then introduce what's dear to you, whether that is 20th century or 21st century music or Dvorak or Bruckner, whatever it is, carefully, slowly, and again, make sure that when you make your first choices, they are incredible and they're really good. I remember when I did my first Schoenberg here in Milwaukee, we put it in a program. It was The Survivor from Warsaw, which is in itself a great and dramatic piece. We played it, and then I wrote a little clarinet cadenza, like a klezmer solo, that would lead into the first note of the Barber Adagio, which I think was good because it gave people a chance to digest the very intense 10 minutes of Schoenberg. And then when that was over, we played the Survivor from Warsaw again, second time in a slightly dramatized version. And people had a very strong reaction to that. I think I've never got more letters, except when I played accordion, on anything than this program juxtaposition.
Right.
And what it did, it started building trust.
Yeah.
After that, I think the next thing we did, which was unusual in 20th century, was this weird Zimmermann cantata with 2 narrators.
Right.
I turned and saw all the injustice under the sun. I built up trust with the audience. So after a while, they would say, well, we don't know the composer that we read there in the program book, but when Delfs is conducting, it's going to be a good performance, and he won't let us down. It will not be a bore. And that kind of sums up my philosophy about programming. I want to do what I love the best, but I want people to come and enjoy it. And in order to do that, I might have to spend a season or 2 to dance around audience's needs and very popular things, so that they do come and understand who I am, what my collaboration with the orchestra is like, and that when I put something unusual or different on the program, that they can trust it's going to be good.
I remember the accordion was a big hit in Milwaukee, which is actually kind of the accordion capital of the United States.
Which I didn't know, and it was so innocent. I wanted to do...
Oh, that's funny.
I'm a great Kurt Weill fan, as you know,
Right.
so I wanted to do the first Kurt Weill that I do here in Milwaukee, the Suite from the Three Penny Opera, which, by the way, Otto Klemperer arranged and commissioned. And it's always, you have to pay a lot of extras. There's a banjo in it and this and that.
A lot of odd instruments.
And I remember the personnel manager saying, oh God, it's costing us so much extra. And so I said, you know, the accordion only plays in one number, and I have an accordion, so I do that myself.
The other thing about programming, of course, and I don't know that it's something that conductors talk to orchestras about, but presumably there's an element of building the orchestra too.
Certainly.
And is that a question of just challenging them progressively, or figuring out what they do well or maybe don't do well?
Yeah, the latter,
Okay.
I would say. Again, this is something that I very much learned from Mazel, who took over the Pittsburgh Symphony. They were always a great orchestra. But after 2 years of no music director and the kind of abrupt departure of Previn, which was a downer morally for the orchestra, they were not in great shape.
Right.
And how he got them within 1.5 season into which I really thought at the time was the best American orchestra. When they played a Stravinsky or a big Strauss tone poem, they were incredible, and they still are. But I saw him do that, and it reminded me like a Swiss watchmaker, you know, who knows exactly where to put a drop of oil and where to use his fine instrument. There's this famous story of an incredibly difficult machine breaks, and only one specialist in the world can fix it. And he comes, and he has this little hammer. He looks at the machine and goes, machine is fixed. And then he sends his bill, and it's outrageous, and it's $9,500. And the owner of the machine says, for that little bit, $9,500? And the guy says, I sent you a specified bill. And what comes back is a bill that says, tapping the machine with hammer, $50. Knowing where to tap, $9,450. And that is pretty much summing up what a good conductor and a great music director does, knowing where to tap. And to find out where the orchestra that you conduct needs a little help consistently. You remember that when I started out here, we played quite a bit of Haydn and Mozart.
Yes.
Because I thought the motor, the Alberti...
It didn't come naturally to us.
No, it needed a little help in going... And it has improved incredibly. And when we play Mozart now, we just did a Mozart festival, and it was such a joy.
Yeah.
Because we fixed that.
Yeah, it was...
And progressively, too, I think an orchestra needs to see regularly the pieces that are really challenging for you. Mahler symphonies, big Stravinsky pieces. I think by now I know which are the pieces that gets the musicians to unpack their instruments a little bit early and prepare.
Yeah.
And I found out it's a great way. For example, when we started, I thought, oh, orchestra has a relatively big summer break, so let's start easy. It was not a good idea.
No.
After we started to do Richard Strauss in the first season,
right.
concert,
Yep.
I thought we started on a much higher level, because
Yep.
that's the kind of stuff that makes you,
Yep.
Let's warm up. So
Yeah.
it's a combination of these things, but I think the most important thing is the little knowing where to tap your hammer.
I wanted to ask you, from your perspective of having been or watched music directors in the U.S. for 20, 25 years now, and knowing that a number of orchestras are actually looking for music directors, and I think they're all struggling with what a music director should be and what the image should be, what will work for them. And obviously it's different in different situations, but do you think there's been any systemic change in how the role is viewed, or the kinds of people that orchestras should be looking at? Or is it just that too general? Is the field too diverse to...
No, it's not. It is a good music director. We don't talk about conductor now, we talk about music director. Has to have a good number of qualities, some musical and some not musical. And what I often find problematic is each given orchestra in their given community at their given time in history needs a specific arrangement of those qualities. Good music director has to be a very good conductor. But even within conducting, there are different qualities. There's the conductor who is incredibly with a stick, but maybe musically a little bit boring. There is the inspiring musical storyteller who is not good with meter changes. Now, depending on where that orchestra stands at the time in its development, also in its relationship with the audience, a couple of years with an inspiring great musician who's not so good with a stick can be the right thing at the time. And you will have those musicians and board members who will kvetch about this period because they say, yeah, but his downbeats are always unclear. Vice versa, you can have a wonderfully inspiring musical orchestra that is just not playing precisely. And a couple of years with somebody who is a little dry might be the right thing. And this is only the conducting aspect of it. And this is only the conducting aspect of it. If you add to that the music director aspects, somebody who's good with the press and interviews, might be important at some time. At a time where an orchestra who might be a very good orchestra is having trouble with audience. Somebody who just relates to the community and says, okay, I'm going to live in this town for 5 years with my family, might be very important. And it might be a good choice for a while to say, well, as a conductor, he's not 100% what we want, maybe just 95%. But as a fundraiser, public relations dynamo, he is what we need right now. So we're going to spend a number of years with this person. And this big picture is often not seen. The musicians tend to look more into
look
this
at what they see.
with a certain understanding of the other parts.
Right.
The board looks into this because that's what they understand, with a certain understanding of the musical qualities. And that's where there's also often disagreement about that.
Right.
You really have to, when you search for a music director, carefully analyze, where are we right now as an orchestra? What do we need musically? Do we need somebody now who rebuilds us? Do we need somebody who just keeps what we're doing good? Do we need somebody mostly who inspires us right now? The board has to look for, do we need somebody who is first and foremost a great conductor because everything else is in good shape? Or do we need somebody who helps us put the orchestra financially back on track, and we take into consideration that he might not be the number one but only the number two choice of the orchestra? This requires a very good, open, trusting dialogue between the musicians and the board and the staff.
Part of the problem, I think, and I was struck, you were saying some orchestras might need someone to come in for a couple of years to be precise. But of course, music directors don't stay for a couple of years. You're actually generally making a marriage with someone that will last 8 to 12, 13 years, typically.
No, typically,
So
I just
you
read the
actually-
numbers. Typically, I think now the typical American music directorship is 7 to 8 years.
Really? Okay.
Yeah.
But even so, to some extent you have to also factor in not just works now, but what you hope will work farther down the road.
And then, as I said, and this is a nice arch to the beginning of our interview, conductors, like everybody else, changes over years. Some conductors learn, some conductors collapse. People change.
Yeah.
If I look at myself, when I came here with young children, my fourth child was just born, and now I have teenagers. I'm a different person than I was then, through a variety of factors that have to do with my personal life, with what I have done professionally in those last 10 years. I'm not the same conductor that I was 10 years ago.
Right.
You've seen that. So you never know whether something that is very, very good stays that good, or something that is not so good will develop and get better. And I normally find that when others, musicians and board members, judge conductors, they are very rigid. They would base their judgment on a conductor based on experience that might be 10, 15, 20 years ago. And I often find myself saying, yeah, but I guarantee you this is not the same person anymore, especially if that early experience was when this person was a young conductor of 20 or 25 years. But we mentioned Mazel. He is now, he's going to be 80 in 2 years, I think,
Yeah.
What a different man, conductor and person he is than when I knew him when he was 60.
Yeah.
So just keep in mind, like any other human beings, conductors change too.
I've had that experience with people, and I've heard such dreadful things about, and then I met them and worked with them, and it was, I have no doubt that it was true 20 years ago, but they've learned, it doesn't work, or they've changed, or... Okay, good, thanks. One of the things I wanted to talk about, I know it's to lump European orchestras as a group against American orchestras, but are there systemic differences you see between American orchestras as a group and, say, German orchestras or English orchestras that you can usefully put your finger on?
The gap has closed. When I started,
in terms of quality? Or?
No, in difference.
Oh, okay.
The gap in difference when I started out in America was clearly American orchestras had less rehearsals, regularly 4 for a subscription concert, but boy did they come prepared to the first rehearsal. European orchestras at that time had 5 or 6 rehearsals, but the first rehearsal really was sight reading the material. That has changed. When I go now, I still have maybe 1 more rehearsal with European orchestras, but the level of preparation and sheer professionalism has raised quite a bit, which makes me very happy. England is a different ballgame. When you go conduct in London, you have a half a rehearsal for 2 subscription concerts, but they are so good that you really just need to establish a few things.
You wonder what they do with 4 or 5.
Yeah, I do. I just did
And it might actually not help.
No, I just did a rather complicated program with the Royal Philharmonic Orchestra, and it included some Strauss that I know they could not possibly have known, excerpts from Daphne. Now, who knows Daphne? But the first read through, I can't tell you, it was perfect. And it had a huge orchestra solo in it anyway. So I think that has changed. The nice thing is that the color difference between European orchestras is still more dramatic than between American orchestras. There are distinct differences between the Milwaukee Symphony and the Indianapolis and the Pittsburgh. But they are not as dramatic in color and philosophy and sound images than, let's say, between the Czech National Symphony and the Orchestre Philharmonique de Monte Carlo.
Or even probably Berlin and Vienna.
Yeah, exactly. There are worlds in between these orchestras, and they're all sounding wonderful, but so different. While in America the differences are a little bit more subtle, probably having to do with that when American orchestras were formed, they were such a melting pot of different ethnic and national influences that they came out much more, I think, colored by the early music directors, the Zells and the Reiners and so forth, than by the individual school of orchestral playing.
Right. There wasn't the kind of 100-year tradition of, whereas in Vienna the principal clarinet is or was the son of the former principal clarinet.
The inbreeding of European orchestras is still very strong, and I remember that from auditions with the Hanover Orchestra. There was a very strong urge to get students. Of course, officially they were not preferred, but I know we got a fair number of students from the Hanover Music Conservatory because they were the students of the principals, and it made sense. They won the audition fair and square, but they were used to the school, to the embouchure, to the style, to the vibrato of their teachers, who happened to be the principals in the orchestra.
I had the chance to see Vienna in Salzburg a few years ago in the pit, and I actually was in the very front row, so I was hovering over about the fourth desk of fiddles, and it was really striking to me. All the fiddle players looked like they studied with the same teacher. It was the same mechanism. You look at this orchestra and it doesn't look anything like that. You know, really strong players, and it's a good first fiddle section, but that kind of everything was the same. It was really, which I'm sure has some downsides if it's something doesn't come naturally to them. But
what now, after having been at this for a couple of years, I can identify in American string section is pretty much where they studied. You know, there is the Dorothy DeLay faction in every American orchestra. There's the David Theron faction. You know, I can kind of tell from which school, whether it's the Cleveland Institute or Peabody or Juilliard. And since several of them are in every American orchestra, I can kind of see that now.
What about personally, in terms of the relationship between the orchestra and the conductor? Does that feel different in Europe than it does here, or is it really just more orchestra by orchestra?
Again, I would say that gap has closed. I always felt in America, if you as the music director wanted it and went for it, it could be much more relaxed and collegial and friendly, and working with committees is something that you do in Europe too, but it was, when I started out in Germany, the gap, the hierarchical gap was much bigger. When I go now, I see that gap is closing too. It's music directors like Simon Rattle with the Berlin Philharmonic that make that difference, that insists in being on par with his musicians. Plus, the generational shift in European orchestras is quite dramatic. If you look at the Berlin Philharmonic now, I think it's maybe a handful of players left that were under Karajan. It's a young professional orchestra, and they have a relatively young music director terms.
And it's a much more diverse group of people in terms of where they come from, their schooling, even just gender. I mean, in terms of where they come from, their schooling, even just gender. I mean, there are a lot of young people in Berlin, and
mind you, it's still very much what you want it to be. If you insist in being called maestro by all of your musicians and being only approached after having made an appointment prior, you can still have that gap if you want to, and you think it serves your purpose. But I want to say it's much easier, and I personally enjoy to have a relaxed relationship with my musicians, and that's much easier to accomplish both in America, where it always was easy, I think, but in Europe too now.
I wanted to talk a little bit about auditions. partly because it's something that I've thought about a lot over the years, but it's, I think as we all know, it's not a perfect system, and yet it seems to produce pretty good results pretty consistently. What have you seen over the years in terms of it working well? I know we've made some changes here over time. What do you think could work better about it? I mean, you've spent pretty much your whole professional life in what you might call the current American system, where there's a committee and there's screened auditions, and the music director may have the final say, but definitely in collaboration with the committee.
I think it ties in very much with what we talked about earlier, the relationship between the music director and the players. I think our auditions here in Milwaukee work very smooth and well, partly because of the system and the way they run, but also partly because we have a relationship with each other that I think no member of the particular audition committee ever thinks, oh, I cannot say this in front of the music director. You know, you can say pretty much everything. And I feel the same way. We are open, we are honest, we joke around. We know that what we talk about stays within that group. I think we're very serious about the not sharing this with any musician other than the members of the audition committee. And again, that's the culture of the relationship we have with each other. I think the decision is really reached jointly, as it is supposed to be on paper, but with some orchestras, it's not. With some orchestras, and I've had that experiences myself, it is that the committee presents the music director with a group of players which includes their real artistic favorite, but it also includes their good friend who has been subbing 900 times and they don't want to hurt feelings, and maybe a member of the orchestra who's auditioning for the job that they think really shouldn't have the job, but they don't want to be the ones to say that, so they say, well, that's why the music director gets paid the big bucks, let him be the nasty guy. That, I think, works less well, because it really leaves the music director with making the choice, which then sometimes might not be what that group really wants. When you present me with a decision, I really know, because we have talked about it openly, who artistically is your favorite. You're not always agree, sometimes it's two. But I would say more often than not, I can really read what you think is the best for the orchestra, or whether nobody and we should go in the next round, or whatever it is. And often we come up with saying, this looks really good, let's play a round of chamber music, let's have that person play a week with the orchestra. And I would say 9 out of 10 cases, I've gone along with that. The point where we sometimes differed in the past is after that first week. I remember once or twice I said no. Or once or twice when it came to tenure, I said no. Or yes, when the committee said no, or was divided. But the initial decision, who are the people that we are really seriously looking at, is really reached jointly. And I think the system of you going through the first group and then go through the semifinals and then presenting me with the final candidates, it works. And the 1 or 2 times where we got stuck, I remember principal timpani auditions. After the third time, I said, please invite me to the semifinals. And it was helpful, because it gave us, because we discussed after the semifinals, you know much more what I was looking for, and I knew why, after having listened to 120 timpani players, it was really hard for you after a while to differentiate.
Timpani is such a hard instrument to audition for anyway.
It was really that. You needed that fresh pair of ears a little earlier than at the finals.
Right.
You needed that in the semifinals, and it yielded a very good result. Right. But again, I think the flexibility on the side of the music director and the openness of the musicians that know they can really talk open and don't have to be afraid that what they say is being relayed to their colleagues or to the members, to the auditioners who don't win the job, and that has no repercussions to them with the music director. I think that is extremely important. And if you build a culture like that, which we have, I think we have been very good and very lucky. If you look, the musicians that I hired here and tenured with your help, it's a pretty darn good group.
Yeah.
And on the other hand, if you see that the musicians that left us during my tenure were to the New York Philharmonic, to the Los Angeles, and to the Cleveland Orchestra.
And St. Louis.
And St. Louis.
Yeah.
That's also a darn good
Yeah.
group that shows that the players that are in this orchestra really like to be in this orchestra and want to be in this orchestra.
Yeah.
Personally, I learned a lot about auditioning from opera, because when you audition 95 sopranos and 65 of them can really sing well, you start to look for other things. You start to look for charisma, for personality. You might ask them a little question between arias, which tells you a little bit who they are. You look at their conduct, you look at their security after the second and the third round, how they're holding up. And it's the same with orchestra auditions. When we audition for any given instrument, we get so many applicants, and many of them can play well. Many of them nail the excerpts. Many of them play a beautiful solo concerto. So we start, especially when it's about principle, to look for a little bit different things. And that's why the prolonged process through different rounds, through chamber music rounds, in a relaxed atmosphere where you can talk a little bit with these guys on stage, through maybe playing a week in the orchestra, you need to know more to make a successful decision than whether this player can play the excerpts well and has a good solo concerto. You need to know more. And to get the whole picture and to be able to hire somebody that you not only know will play well in the orchestra, but also will fit well into this organism of 100 people who have their specific chemistry with each other. That needs a rather fragile mechanism, which I think we have shaped rather well here.
And it's always difficult and painful to fix a bad decision after the fact.
Yes.
So.
Yes, it is. And you know...
And sometimes it doesn't happen because it is so hard and painful for
Yeah, well, that's
everybody.
the other spectrum of a music director's work. You can shape an orchestra's personnel by making good hire decision, but you also have to get into the harder area, which is, termination, which gratefully I have not done very often, because more often than not it is talking to a musician who might be at the end of his career or her career, and just talking about that and asking about the plans for the future. And the ones that have it right and where it went smoothly are the ones that say, well, I have maybe another 3 or 4 years, so I would appreciate if you let me, sometimes move back into the section, or sometimes just not be too tough about me or so. But there are people, and I've experienced it here and other places, that are in that position where they create problems for their section, but then come to you and say, I don't know about any problem. Everything's perfect. What are you talking about? Nobody ever said anything about me. And then you have a problem that, again, in the American system, you can only suggest a termination. The final decision, as you know, with the process of arbitration and a panel of peers, the final decision is the one decision of the musicians. And the 2 times that I had to do that here in Milwaukee, both times I was backed up by the players and by the colleagues in my decision.
One of the things we've started doing here with auditions, and I remember when it happened, it was a audition for second violin, and we had 2 candidates, and we had the option of a chamber music round, and it actually switched the committee's position around. Mm-hmm. And since that time, we've pretty much done chamber music for most every position. Mm-hmm. Is that helpful to you? Is it helpful in terms of what you hear, or what you get back reported from the people playing, or both?
Well, when we do the chamber music round, I like to sit on stage and be very nearby. And having played chamber music myself and accompanied a lot as a pianist, I know that it's a different vibrations going on at that point. And I remember just a couple of weeks ago, it was amazing because we had dismissed a player from the final rounds, and then I suggested, and that again was a good sign of how easy we relate to each other. I said, guys, would it be completely out of the question if we ask this person to come back? And you said yes, and it changed our opinion completely.
We actually had to call them up because they'd gone back
they had
to
already
the hotel.
Gone to the hotel.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
I think in chamber music I see so much more in terms of leadership qualities, eye contact, body language, ability to be flexible, when you do quartet or quintet that you normally prepare before that round, and you have a certain idea about the tempo. And so I can immediately tell that this player came with a different concept, and either is rigid about it and not able to fit in, or is flexible enough about it to inspire you with his or her ideas, yet smoothly fit into what you think about the piece. And that's a lot of what a conductor has to do at work. So these chamber music rounds are extremely helpful for me, and then later talking with the members of the quartet or quintet, which are not always the same that are members of the audition committee, that also helps a lot to hear what they have to say.
I would imagine also that hearing that sound in the context of other sounds that you know. I mean, you know how Frank, our concertmaster, sounds and what I sound like. So when you hear a cellist in that context, it gives you a little more sense of what they really... Because sometimes on stage, even if you're sitting on the stage, much less in our hall, it's very hard to really make that judgment. How are they going to fit with everybody else?
Yeah, and it becomes as much, if not more, an issue with wind players.
Oh, yeah.
When we hire a wind player, we do excerpts with the wind section. Because if you have something like, let's say, the opening of the slow movement of Brahms 4, or any given, which is not a solo, but with a section really has to go, where the two bassoons and the two clarinets have to sound like one instrument when they play a four-part harmony. Extremely important for me to know that this player's style, embouchure, and instrument, the physical instrument, fits in well. And sometimes we had situations where we said, this is the player we want, but we would like to talk about that player, about change of equipment, which has happened. I remember with the horns that has happened. We hired a fabulous horn player, but we had to ask her to change equipment, which she was willing to, and now she fits beautifully into our section.
I remember a second oboe audition, which I actually heard as union representative, and it was second oboe, but part of the audition was the whole wind section was there playing one of the Mozart octets, and a long stretch of it. It was maybe the whole scherzo minuet movement.
C minor, yeah.
With several candidates. I mean, it took a long time, but it was actually very revealing.
Yep.
It was very revealing, even to a violist, much less to the people on the committee.
Yeah.
I wanted to talk a little bit and pretty much end our talk today with, because this is part of Polyphonic's spotlight on the MSO, just talking about the MSO in particular and what makes it different to the extent it is different, and you know how you feel that you and us have evolved as part of that relationship, and kind of what you hope to leave behind.
The sound of the Milwaukee Symphony I liked and loved from the beginning on. You remember I came to guest conduct a few years before I was...
We did Schubert and Renish, I remember.
Schumann Renish, exactly.
Schumann Renish, right. Yeah, sorry.
And it was a quality that reminded me of the Pittsburgh Symphony, where I had spent many years before, which is commonly labeled as a Germanic sound quality, which basically means that Brahms and Beethoven and Schumann and Schubert and Bruckner and Mahler has an inherent sound quality. The mix of strings and winds, and specifically the string sound, has the right kind of dark glow to it, virtuosity and brilliance, but a shining copper kind of color. It's very hard to describe in specific words. It's a specific sound that these pieces require, that you can work for years and not achieve it if it's not somehow inherent. I know in Pittsburgh it was clearly the many years that they worked with William Steinberg.
Right.
And I think here in Milwaukee, it's hard for me, you tell me, whether it was Kenneth Schermerhorn or whether it was... I always felt that the need in Milwaukee, having a rather Germanic population structure, you could always give them a lot of Brahms and Beethoven and Schubert and Bruckner, and it was always appreciated very much. So I think it was maybe simply playing a lot of Germanic repertory with this orchestra that made it perfect. And it was always an orchestra that I wanted, because that is a repertory I like the most, and I know we would relate on it. And the piece that I then did as a music director candidate was Brahms 3.
That's right.
And I remember that very strongly, because I think when we do Brahms together, it brings the best out in both of us, both in the orchestra and in the conductor, and it's always wonderful. What I wanted to achieve then and shape a little bit was, as I said before, there were a couple of important personnel decisions to make, and collaboratively I think we made decisions that really raised the bar and raised the level of this orchestra quite a bit. We have some outstanding musicians in the orchestra. We always had some that had been here before, but I think the new acquisitions, as it were, generally raised the bar in this orchestra.
Who actually, I should point out, somewhat unusually are not all people out of school.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, Todd Levy, for example, came here. Todd was well into his career.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there have been some younger players,
Yeah.
but it's been an interesting mix.
Yeah, Todd is a very interesting case, and I know he won't mind talking about it because we had talked about it openly. I had known Todd through school because we went to Juilliard together, and I know exactly who he was and what he was. And his audition, he won it hands down, but another candidate also came up very high, so they both played a week with us. And when that came to that decision, it was not as unanimous as I thought it would be. There were people who thought the other candidate was
Right.
better. And I mean, it was not dramatic, it was kind of 50-50, but I put my foot down. And boy, did Todd make a difference in this orchestra in the long run.
Yeah, he's made an impact.
But there are other players, and not just principal, but also section players. Because of our process of really x-raying them to the fullest, I think we didn't hire any player who's not just a great player, but also fits into this specific mix. This is a very good orchestra in terms of being good colleagues. This is a friendly orchestra. There are no big infighting issues in this orchestra. I've guest conductors in orchestra where people yell at each other in the middle of rehearsal, and you know that happens.
Yeah.
People can be very high-strung, and there can be very well-honed and long-standing conflicts within an orchestra, personal and artistic. I was always very glad to maintain a rehearsal and work atmosphere in this orchestra where decency and civility are, I think we all interact with each other very civil, because that's what this orchestra had done in the past and should do in the future.
Yeah.
Makes a difference.
Yeah.
There were a couple of technical issues, and we mentioned them already, where I think I tried to put my little hammer here and there, and I think
Well, some of that's an issue with the stage we play on too, which is not easy. And
Hard to
also
hear.
that has changed too. We had a big renovation
that.
about 6-7 years ago.
We did that. I worked on some specific technical issues which I think have improved. And one thing that I think helped us tremendously to become a better orchestra is our recording issues. We record for radio. We have done that a long time, and I paid a lot of attention editing those tapes, which helped me myself hearing strengths and weaknesses in the orchestra when I listened to all performances to decide which was the best to go on the radio. After we started publishing, doing our first recordings together, Nutcracker and Prokofiev and the Cuba recordings.
Which were all off radio tapes.
Yes.
Right.
But then Hansel and Gretel, which
Right.
was live.
Right.
And now iTunes. I think the musicians know that what they play will be heard by a lot of people. They already knew that through the radio, but they knew that even now more through iTunes and our binaural
It's
recordings.
less ephemeral. You know, it's a permanent record.
It's a matter of pride now.
Yeah.
And I remember, this week I said in one moment, I said, let's get this really good, because it's going to go on iTunes. Made a difference.
Yeah.
So I think that we have the pride and also the self-control that what we do is heard all over the nation and through the internet internationally, also got us to a level of polished playing that is probably one notch up than it was 10 years ago.
Do you think at all about a legacy? Or, I mean,
No, that's
you're a
not
little young to
something-
be thinking about a
No.
legacy, but music directors want to be, like anybody, want to be remembered and want to be remembered for a contribution. I mean, you haven't thought specifically
No.
about. Okay.
I know what we have, and I think we had and still have. I mean, I'm going to stay another 2 years. A very good time with each other, and I know that some pieces I do better than others, and I enjoy the fact that the musicians talk to me about that, You know, that I know when I did especially well, and I also know when I did a piece that I maybe should not do again. We have a very open relationship, and that's what I would really like to be remembered for. That the 12 years that you spent with Andreas Delfs as music director were generally successful years, where we had good audiences, where the orchestra was generally very healthy, where the level of playing continuously grew. Dohnanyi once said to me, the only measure stick that you can measure the quality of a conductor by is really what shape does he leave the orchestra in when he leaves. And that's true. And I think I leave this orchestra in very good shape.
Good. Thank you.